Dr. John Rayleigh Briggs was a physician from Dallas, Texas. On June 8, 1886, Dr. Briggs became the first non-Native American to consume peyote and record its effects. Following his unpleasant experiment with the entheogen, Briggs published his experience in the Medical Register in May of 1887, marking the first study of peyote that appears in print. Bearing the title Mescal Buttons, Physiological Effects, Personal Experience, Briggs describes his initial interest and reasons for wanting to try peyote, explaining, "Learning first from my brother, who has spent several years among the different tribes of wild Indians, and subsequently from Mexicans, that both Indians and Mexicans eat this fruit for purposes of intoxication, I became interested in its physiological effects. The Indians use it that they may forget their troubles and see beautiful visions, such as buffalo and wild horses come up out of the earth." Briggs then goes on to recount his reaction after ingesting the cactus, recalling the following from his notes. At 10 a.m., June 20, 1886, I ate 1/3 of those buttons, or prickly plants, and with pencil and paper and watch before me, awaited results. In 15 minutes afterward, I felt a slight fullness in my carotids, and found my pulse had gone from 60 normal to 70. In 15 minutes more, the feeling in my head and throat was becoming very unpleasant, one of over-arterial tension, and my pulse had reached 90. My respirations had gone up from this time from 18 normal to 26. The unpleasant fullness of my head rapidly increased until 10:45, when my head began to ache and I felt dizzy. My pulse had then reached 120 and my respirations 30. Soon after the 45 minutes had passed, a sudden and alarming jump in my pulse occurred, reaching 160. The peculiar and dazed feelings I then experienced, together with alarm, prevented taking notes on respirations, and therefore don't know the number, but they had certainly still further increased. It seemed to me my heart was simply running away with itself, and it was with considerable difficulty I could breathe air enough to keep me alive. I felt intoxicated, and for a short time particularly lost consciousness. Automatically, I rushed to my able friend, Dr. E.J. Beale of Fort Worth, my residence at the time. After giving him an idea, as best as I could, of the trouble, he prescribed aromatic spirits, ammonia, and whiskey in large doses every few minutes. This I took, if I remember right, 1 hour after having taken the mescal button. It seemed necessary for me to walk in the open air for me to breathe. In about half an hour, I felt some relief, and my pulse and respirations gradually became less until in about 6 or 8 hours they were about normal. No bad consequences followed. I did, however, feel much depressed for about 12 hours, a feeling of malaise. The recollection of such experience is vividly impressed upon my mind. I believe if prompt aid had not been given to me, I should have died. Whatever may be the ultimate constituents of this poison, it certainly is the most violent and rapid of all fruits, or even medicines, known to me, manifesting its first effects in less than 15 minutes. I know of nothing like it except opium and cocaine. The most notable point is the rapidity with which it increases the heart's action. Next, the intoxication and subsequent depression. I think it well worth the trouble to investigate the matter. One man's experience is worth but little, and it is to be hoped some enterprising experimenter will carry out the research. As to myself, I must admit I feel somewhat abstemious on the subject. Years later, when a study on peyote was being conducted by Prentice and Morgan, the researchers, having read Briggs' strange account and suspecting the doctor might have consumed another variety of cactus besides peyote, given his unusual reaction, wrote him a letter. In August 1896, John Briggs wrote the pair back, explaining that he in fact had eaten peyote cactus and was quite certain of it. Briggs also revealed that not only had he tested the cactus on himself, but he even fed it to his dogs, explaining in his letter, "I note with much pleasure your paper in the medical record of 22D instant on the mescal buttons. I am the Briggs referred to therein, and until convinced otherwise, I shall believe that I made the first experiments with this new therapeutic agent. 1/3 of a large green button came near killing me. I never want to go through the experiment again. That what I had was the identical plant you refer to there can be no question, but the button I chewed and swallowed was green, at least 3 inches across, and 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch thick. It being a sample button sent to me was the largest that could be found. I made several experiments on dogs. In each instance, the dog would after an hour or two drag his hind legs, and the flow of urine was greatly increased. The dogs would howl and seem to be in great distress. The most I ever gave one was 3 buttons, tied up in beefsteak, which they swallowed." Dr. Briggs' report was later republished in the Druggist Bulletin, where it was seen by George S. Davis, the general manager of Parke Davis and Company of Detroit, Michigan, the oldest pharmaceutical company in America. After reading his report on peyote, Davis contacted the Dallas physician in order to obtain more information about the plant and hopefully procure some to do research into its medical potential. After receiving George Davis's inquiry into the cactus and request for sample specimens, Dr. Briggs sends a response to the company on May 24th, 1887, writing, "There is, so far as I can ascertain, absolutely no literature in English on this plant. I should not think you would want large quantities of it by the bale. I am certain 2 buttons would kill a white man." Nonetheless, Dr. Briggs agrees to provide Parke Davis & Co. with a steady supply of peyote buttons, which he explains are smuggled through from Mexico to Texas by a half-breed Mexican who makes it a business to furnish the wild tribes of Indians with it. On June 8, 1887, Parke Davis & Co. receive a cigar box full of dried peyote buttons given to them by Briggs, which they promptly sent to various botanists, chemists, and pharmacologists. On July 5, 1887, one of Parke Davis's in-house chemists, Frank Augustus Thompson, prepared alcoholic extracts from Briggs's samples, reporting that it contained a large amount of alkaloids. Thompson and others at the Parke Davis laboratories wanted to market peyote as a cardiac stimulant and attempted to do so over the next few years. Other samples were sent to Parke Davis's botanical consultant, Dr. Henry Rusby, professor of botany and materia medica at the College of Pharmacy in New York. Unable to identify Briggs's cactus botanically, he sent samples to Serena Watson of the Botanic Garden at Harvard in Cambridge. According to Watson, the cactus belonged in the genus Anhelonium. But most famous of all those who had received peyote samples obtained by John Briggs was the famed German pharmacologist Louis Lewin, who is known for his 1924 text, Fantastica. On September 16, 1887, while visiting the United States, Lewis stopped by Parke Davis in Detroit, where he was given a tour of the facility by Superintendent H.A. Wetzel, as well as a sample of Briggs's peyote to investigate. Once he returned home, Lewin showed the cactus to Paul Christoph Hennings, a botanist at the Berlin Botanical Garden, who identified it as a new species of Anhelonium cactus, naming it Anhelonium lewinii in honor of Lewin. February 10, 1888, Hennings presented his paper Eine giftige Cactea, a poisonous cactus, to the Botanical Society of Berlin, the first published identification of peyote. Working in his lab in Berlin that same year, Lewin extracts his first alkaloid from Briggs's peyote sample, naming it anhalanine. In 1889, Parke Davis finds a more reliable source of peyote compared to Briggs's Mexican smuggled material, whose supplier required advanced payment up front for larger amounts. Though some sources indicate that Parke Davis received their initial supply from a Mrs. Anna B. Nichols, a cacti collector living in Laredo sometime in the early 1880s, the company claimed that they have no record of this. Others say that after John Briggs was unable to come through with a shipment to the company, Mrs. Anna Nichols was able to step in and fulfill their request. It seems that Nichols was selling peyote by mail, making her one of the earliest commercial peyote suppliers in history, and certainly the first and only woman back then to do so. In any case, Parke Davis and Company now received their peyote buttons from Laredo, and they began selling dried peyote buttons and preparations of the cactus, which was then known by its Latin binomial nomenclature, Anhelonium lewenii, becoming named after Louis Lewin that previous year in 1888. In February of 1889, the company's catalog advertised that the effects of the cactus had a physiological action similar to strychnine. Over the next few years, the company made attempts to market peyote products as a cardiac stimulant and general tonic. In 1894, a change to peyote's taxonomic nomenclature occurred when American botanist John M. Coulter recategorized the cactus, moving it into a new genus called Lophophora, with the mescaline-containing species now known as Lophophora williamsii. It wouldn't be until 1897 that German chemist Arthur Heffter would successfully isolate peyote's active component, the chemical 3,4,5-trimethoxyphenethylamine, which he names mescaline. On November 23, 1897, Heffter ingested 150 milligrams of the hydrochloride salt of mescaline, confirming that the purified compound was responsible for peyote's effects, explaining that the experience induced by the synthetic mescaline hydrochloride was indistinguishable from that of eating. In the summer of 1933, the Witte Museum of San Antonio sponsored the excavation of 8 dry shelters at an archaeological site known as Shumla Cave No. 5, located in southwestern Texas along the Rio Grande Valley, around 150 miles outside of San Antonio. The dig resulted in a remarkable find, with George C. Martin discovering 2 prehistoric peyote button specimens which had been dried and preserved, indicating evidence of human use going back thousands of years in Texas. In 2005, researchers borrowed the buttons from the Witte Museum's collection to analyze them, subjecting the specimens to radiocarbon dating and alkaloid analysis. The results of radiocarbon dating indicated that the specimens were from around 3,780 to 3,660 BC. The researchers' alkaloid extraction yielded approximately 2% of alkaloids, sitting just under the average concentrations of mescaline that would be found in fresh specimens found today. The museum made yet another discovery in the area in 1953 with a piece of prehistoric rock art known as the White Shaman Mural. The large, 26-foot-long mural, standing 13 feet tall, depicts what academics believe to be a peyote ritual, with the rock art being dated as far back as 200 BC. Today, members of the Native American Church consider the site sacred. Though sacramental use of peyote, whose original Nahuatl name is Peyote, was mostly confined to the tribes who would have existed further north, in the areas which are now South Texas and northern Mexico, the indigenous peoples further south, around the area that is now Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, used various other species of visionary cacti, which they called huachuma, with evidence of its use by humans going back as far as 1300 BC. Growing in the area located around the Andes Mountains, the tall, fast-growing columnar cacti contain levels of mescaline which sit just under the amounts of its northern brother peyote. The visionary cacti species, when originally discovered by science, were placed in the genus Trichoceros by Britton and Rose. The most common of the species, which the natives call huachuma, is a species called Trichoceros pachanoi, but there were several other species that are used and even preferred by Andean shaman who work with the plant, including Trichoceros briggsii and Trichoceros peruvianus, known by their common names, the Bolivian torch cactus and the Peruvian torch cactus, respectively. But there are also numerous other mescaline-containing species which exist in the genus. Some of these species, like Briggsii and more so Peruvianus, contain much higher amounts of mescaline than Trichoceres pachanoi, which is the most common species of the genus in America, used as an ornamental cactus, often found in front of people's homes in the Southwest, and widely available for purchase at any garden store. Until relatively recently, the cacti were classified by the names of the species falling under the genus Trichoceres, but in recent years, the species of cacti have been moved into the genus Echinopsis, after taxonomists attempted to consolidate several genera of cacti, resulting in alternative Latin binomials. Though the move to calling the species Echinopsis has not been universally adopted, with many preferring to use their original names, with the species kept in the genus Trichoceres. After the European colonization of the Americas, the cactus became known by the name it's known as today, San Pedro, the Spanish name for Saint Peter. The Spanish Catholic missionaries who gave the cactus its common name picked a fitting title in that Saint Peter held the keys to heaven, mirroring the spiritual beliefs about the cactus held by the natives who used it. Unfortunately, the Spanish explorers made a concerted effort to stamp out any native religious practices by the indigenous peoples of the Americas, including the use of Huachuma cactus by the tribes who viewed it as divine, so the colonists could instead spread their Catholic religion. The native religious traditions practiced by the indigenous communities were driven underground, with their spiritual practices and worship of plants becoming fused with Christianity. These spiritual practices, now often intertwined with Christian belief, are still practiced today in many indigenous communities across Latin America. Besides peyote and huachuma, a third type of visionary cactus, which naturally grows in Mexico, was discovered in a species called Pachyceres pringlei, often called the Mexican cardone and sometimes the elephant cactus. It's a species of cactus which also holds the unique distinction of being the tallest cactus on Earth. It was discovered by Dr. Alexander Shulgin, the Californian chemist responsible for reintroducing MDMA to the world, turning on psychotherapists like Leo Zeff after he synthesized and bioassayed the compound in 1967, finding it unlike anything he had ever tried before. Shulgin, after eating Pachyceres pringlei, found it to be psychedelic, although analysis of the cactus revealed that it contained no mescaline. A paper published in 1982 revealed that, rather than any psychedelic phenethylamine like mescaline, the effects of the cactus were from a simple tetrahydroisoquinoline, isolated by research known as tehuanine N-oxide, though in the case of Pachyceres pringlei, there is little proof of any evidence of human use by Native American tribes as of yet. The Native American Church grew out of the Pan-Indian movement sometime around 1870. Comanche chief Quanah Parker, who by some accounts was born in Texas, started the religion after discovering peyote's miraculous properties one summer. Though he lived most of his life in Oklahoma, Quanah visited his uncle in Texas, where he was gorged by a bull, badly wounding him and leaving him with a deadly fever. After being given a tea made from the cactus, prepared by a Mexican curandera, Quanah found that all of his ailments had almost instantly and miraculously vanished. From that point on, Quanah made it his life's goal to spread word of peyote to his fellow Native American tribes, with peyote's influence spreading to the Plains tribes further north where it had not grown previously. Tribes would make a pilgrimage to South Texas on a trek known as the Peyote Road to buy peyote buttons from Texas peyoteros who had harvested the cacti for generations. During the early 1890s, Smithsonian Institute archaeologist James Mooney witnessed several Native American peyote ceremonies in Oklahoma, becoming the first white man to witness such, and having his own experience with the plant soon after. Recognizing the need to unite the various tribes and protect their legal right to worship with peyote, Mooney drafted the bylaws for the Native American Church of Oklahoma that was incorporated in 1918. Later in the 20th century, as peyotism and use by the Native American Church continued to grow, there were efforts made by authorities to try and stamp out its use, including a dozen states outlawing peyote in 1930. Use of the cactus by non-Native Americans began to spread too during the early parts of the 20th century. One of the earliest accounts of non-natives consuming the cactus comes from a curious story published in a book called Unknown Mexico by Norwegian ethnographer Carl Lumholtz. In it, Lumholtz states, Major J.B. Pond of New York informs me that in Texas, during the Civil War, the so-called Texas Rangers, when taken prisoner and deprived of all other stimulating drinks, used mescal buttons, or white mule as they called them. They soaked the plants in water and became intoxicated with the liquid. Also in 1902, an article titled Mescal, a Study of a Divine Plant, was published in Popular Science. 5 years later, on March 12, 1907, Aleister Crowley injects the Parke Davis fluid extract of peyote. Crowley would go on to consume peyote regularly after the fact, making the plant a sacrament in his Thelema religion. In 1930, Aldous Huxley met Crowley and heard about his consumption of peyote. At 11 o'clock a.m. on May 6, 1953, Aldous Huxley tries 0.4 of a gram of mescaline, given to him by Humphrey Osmond, the British psychiatrist responsible for coining the term psychedelic drugs, which had before then only been referred to as psychomimetic, with researchers believing that they provided the perfect model of psychosis. Previously, in 1952, Osmond had begun using mescaline to treat alcoholics in Canada. In 1954, following Huxley's encounter with the compound, he publishes his experience in a book called The Doors of Perception, which would introduce mescaline to millions of people for the first time. Starting in the 1950s, the American counterculture fell in love with the cactus when the American literary and artistic intelligentsia began to be influenced by peyote. This included the Beat generation of authors, like William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg, having tried the buttons in the early 50s, the latter having eaten peyote as he walked along Greenwich Village, turning the religious experience he had with the cactus into the work which would become his landmark poem, Howl. On April 16, 1960, American chemist Alexander Shulgin had his first experience with mescaline, consuming 400 milligrams of mescaline sulfate. The experience moved him so much that he decided to dedicate the rest of his life to the discovery of psychedelic compounds, becoming the most prolific psychedelic chemist of all time. Shortly thereafter, in 1962, clandestine chemist Nick Sand, the man who would become responsible for creating California's Orange Sunshine LSD, had his first psychedelic experience by way of mescaline also. In 1960 in Texas, peyote would spread among the young members of the Austin folk scene when it was introduced by Chet Helms. In the early part of the 60s, anthropology and chemistry students at the University of Texas made a habit of foraging the buttons, which were ground down and boiled into a goo, which could then be put into small capsules for easier means of consumption by members of Austin's hip community. This included the 13th floor elevator's Tommy Hall and Powell St. John. After he first tried peyote in 1962, having read about mescaline in Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, and eager to see if its effects would aid his art, Powell started his own local cactus farm called Morris Orchids in Laredo, Texas. Once LSD became more readily available, recreational use of peyote dwindled until the end of the decade, when the cactus was included in the list of substances made illegal by the Controlled Substances Act in the United States, outlawing all of the widely known used psychedelics at the time. Its use by the Native American Church continued, but was threatened by the fact that peyote was now a prohibited plant under U.S. law. In 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed to provide legal protection for the church and their use of the cactus. Landmark Supreme Court cases in the 1990s led to President Bill Clinton signing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1993, guaranteeing the rights of the church to use the cactus as part of their religious ceremonies. Today, members of the Native American Church still make pilgrimages to the Peyote Gardens of South Texas, where they may purchase buttons from licensed peyoteros so that they may consume the plant as part of their religion, a right guaranteed to them by U.S. law. Unfortunately, unlike in the 60s when the cactus was still plentiful, overharvesting, coupled with the fact that the peyote cactus can take decades to mature, has led to the peyote populations of South Texas having dwindled so much that the cactus faces the threat of becoming an endangered species soon. As far as recreational use is concerned, the rarity of the cactus means that most Americans outside of the Native American Church will likely never get a chance to try peyote, having to opt for the faster growing, though less potent, Trichoceros or Echinopsis species instead, which are not prohibited by U.S. law unless processed for human consumption, as the mescaline contained within them is scheduled.